Hey friends, welcome to the Salty Swede Presents. As I work my way through the resin wormhole, I've mostly worked with Let's Resin epoxy resin, and it worked fine for most things, but I started to wonder what I was missing out on. Is there something better out there? So I asked a Facebook group I belong to, what am I missing? What do the experienced resiners use and why? A few responses gave me some ideas, but not only are there different types of resin, deep pour, countertop, casting, and UV, but within those categories there are hundreds of brands. How do I know what's best for me? I knew I'd probably want to branch out of my smaller projects, but I didn't know exactly how or when. But I've learned through my crafting journey, the more I work with something, the better I understand it, even if it was through a lot of mistakes. I've realized in the last few years that it's not the end result of my projects that I like, but learning how to understand and maybe even master a technique. I'm incredibly lucky that I have the time and a budget that allows me to really dive into something and be able to work with it almost daily. There are very few people out there that can. So I want to share what I know and give you a realistic idea of how to do something. In this case, an introduction to resin brands. Maybe I'll save you a bit of hassle and money if you want to give resin a shot. What I found out as I tried other brands was every single one of them is different, and some do things well and some not. What I also discovered was that mica was universally difficult to work with in resin because of the bubbles, and mica doesn't stop moving after you pour it. It drove me crazy trying to find the secret to keeping it where I wanted it, and I made a lot of ugly coasters before, and still do, because you never know what resin is going to do. And mica is tough, and you'll see why as you watch me work with different brands. These tests also helped me understand how one resin works well in one application and not another. I tried coating a tumbler I had glittered and I used Let's Resin to see how it went and it was an utter failure. And although this can be frustrating, in my opinion, that's kind of the fun. That tumbler was a fourth try, but I did it smart. My first and second try, I used old tumblers I had around the house because I knew it was not going to turn out the way I wanted it to, so why get stressed out about it? I mean, it gave me an excuse to buy glitter. What's not to like? Not everyone has money to splurge on craft supplies, so take that into consideration when crafting. Hopefully this video will give you some pointers. My old standby, Let's Resin, seemed a logical place to start in my reporting. I will say that even though it doesn't work for everything, Let's Resin is a good brand. My research includes their fast cure formula, and I'll go over the differences. I like it because it's a lower viscosity, which means fewer bubbles, which are the enemy of mica and resin. As you can see in the video, that mixture is pretty runny, and that's what I want. In most resins, part A is thicker, higher viscosity, than B, which is typically the hardener. There are bubbles from pouring it from my bottle, but even as I stir, the mixture is still pretty translucent. Resin is always a little science experiment, and we've got that on display here. These two equal parts of liquid, that's by volume, not weight, make sure you read your instructions, need to be combined to create a solid, and over the course of the next several hours, a lot of things have to happen. The first and most important thing to get right is your measurements. Make sure you are following the instructions so that you're measuring correctly. All of the brands I've tried are measured by volume. These two parts are different weights, so it makes enough of a difference that you should do it right. It's easy to cut corners, and I like to line those up with my mistakes, especially when it comes to resin. But I have found some things that work well for me that you might like. Resin is about the fussiest craft there is, and if you're not ready to learn the hard way or be really patient, then this is not the hobby for you. But there are a ton of ways you can use it, so it's good to have an understanding of it in the event you want to make something that includes resin as part of a larger project. Challenge number one, this stuff is a mess. There are no buts about it. Every surface of your workspace has to be covered. I use silicone mats because they're easy to clean up, but if you just want to try resin once, put down some newspaper or plastic sheeting and then throw it away. Always wear gloves. Not just because it's messy, but because uncured resin on your skin can cause an allergy, which could mean you can't work with it anymore. If you do get it on your skin, clean with a baby wipe and then wash your skin thoroughly. Resin won't wash off with water. I wear a crappy old fleece when I work with resin because I'm always getting it on my sleeve. I know, it couldn't possibly happen to you. But tell me that when you're cutting some resin out of your hair because you didn't put it up before you started. This crap is messy, so plan for it and set yourself up for success. Challenge number two, waste. Cups and sticks and paper towels and baby wipes. All of this goes in the garbage. I really wish there was a way around this, but I can't see it. I found a few ways to reuse things, but it's tough. If I leave my stick in my resin cup and let it cure, I can usually pull it out of the cup pretty easily if I do it the next day. If I wait too long, the resin may not come out. The second most important part is stirring. We need to make sure that these two chemicals are getting mixed together perfectly, or our little science experiment isn't going to work. Resin has to get hot in order to cure, but we don't want it to get too hot because it will start to cure in some parts and not others. This is called a flash cure and can be dangerous. As our research continues, we'll see that happen. I've mostly seen it happen when I'm working with a large amount of resin, and let's discuss what that means. I like to work in the 30 to 250 milliliter range. That includes coasters, small trays, and vessels. This is a really good scale to work in because although a flash cure can occur, it's less likely if you're careful. If I separate my resin into smaller portions, I can avoid a flash cure because the heat is lowered in those smaller amounts. One of the resins in this video repeatedly flash cured in pretty small amounts, but I don't have too much trouble otherwise. What is also important to know is that if your resin is not getting hot enough, it may not cure at all. When working in small amounts, that's less than 30 milliliters, your chemicals may not generate enough heat to cure on their own. By keeping my hand around the cup while I'm stirring, I'm raising the temperature and helping it warm. That leads me to challenge number 3, temperature sensitivity. Resin likes to work at around 78 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 25 degrees Celsius. Not the typical household, so you may have to warm your resin a bit to get it to work. It also needs to stay in that warm place, so don't leave it in the cold garage and expect it to cure. Could it work? Maybe. There's a lot of that in resin. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's all just a big experiment. If you want to make something really small, something that's less than 30 milliliters, see if you can make it with UV resin. That's a whole different animal that I'm just starting to explore, so I'll report on that another time. As I'm stirring, you can see the resin's appearance change. This is the most important part of our experiment, getting those two chemicals combined perfectly. I scrape the sides and the bottom of the cup and that little right angle where they meet. That's where you'll often find uncured resin the next day. Stir slowly. We're not making meringue, we're combining two chemicals, and stirring them faster isn't going to mix them better, it's just going to make more bubbles, so slow down. I use my home assistant a lot when I'm using resin, and it really helps me keep things straight. Stirring is very important, so do it right. Sit back, relax, and let Alexa tell you when your time's up. If I'm mixing more than 50 milliliters, I stir for 5 minutes. If it's less, then I do it for 4 minutes. That sounds like a really long time, but it's not about how long it takes. It's about how well you're mixing. If you do this well, you've overcome your second hurdle. Once we've thoroughly mixed our resin for 5 minutes, we're going to move on to our next step, separating the resin into smaller portions and adding mixatives. This is also the perfect time to try to get rid of some of those bubbles. There are a few ways to do this, and not all of them will be successful with all resins. So here's what I've learned. Of the brands I've tried, Let's Resin and Craft Resin have the fewest bubbles after stirring, but there are always some. That's just part of working with liquids. I use a degassing machine that I got from Let's Resin, and it works pretty well. But this is a splurge, so don't buy one unless you really want to invest in this hobby. I think I spent around $100 on it. And here's my favorite tip for working with mica: make a paste. I was doing this a different way before I figured out this trick. If I add a small amount of mixed resin to my small cup and then add the mica powder, I can make a paste that will incorporate into my resin really, really nicely. I mix the paste thoroughly and then hit it with my heat gun to pop bubbles. By keeping the amount very small, I have fewer bubbles to begin with. I'll make the paste that I need while I wait for my large portion to degas, and once it's done, I'll distribute the rest of the resin into those smaller cups. You can also leave your resin to stand and degas naturally. In this case, I'm going to be waiting a while because I know Let's Resin needs to sit for quite a while before I can pour it in this application. If you're working with glitter or alcohol inks, you don't really need to let it sit before you pour it, except to try to get it bubble free. But since mica powder does weird things in resin, I've learned how to compensate for that. Let's Resin says their working time is around 40 minutes, but I know that if I pour this at 40 minutes, it's just going to continue to move around and my finished coaster isn't going to look at all how I wanted it when I started. As the temperature gets hotter and the resin begins to cure, it's going to move around. But in the case of Let's Resin, I know that I have to wait until it's been sitting for about 55 minutes before I pour, or the resin is just going to become a muddled mess like in this sample coaster. So after I've got my resin divided and mixed with mica, I'm going to leave it alone. When I finished my initial stir, I had Alexa set a timer for 55 minutes, so I know when it's time to pour. In the meantime, I'll move on to my next brand, Alumilite Clear Cast Epoxy. so I can tell you the difference. I bought this at Hobby Lobby because I was waiting for my Amazon delivery of another brand, and I have to say I'm not a fan. Part A was very thick, and that could have been because of the temperature, but when I tried warming the bottles in a water bath, it caused a flash cure. It started gelling in about 25 minutes, and I was hopeful that would mean my mica would stay put, but I couldn't get it hotter than 74 degrees until my third attempt when it flash cured. Worst of all, my finished resin still smells terrible, and I don't know if the over will ever leave my house. I do not recommend this brand. I'm sure it works for some stuff, but between the viscosity and bubbles, and worse yet, the smell, I won't buy it again. Next up is Promise Tabletop Epoxy, which I purchased on Amazon. I chose this brand because I use eye candy mica powders, and they sell this brand on their website, so I assumed it would be perfect for mica. I was wrong. The recommended room temperature for this product is 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, with a work time of 30 to 40 minutes and a full cure in 72 hours. It's very thick out of the bottle, and in my experience, that usually means bubbles. I also think it stinks, but not everyone agrees. I needed to remind myself that it says right on the label, tabletop resin, which should have been a clue to me that this might not work. But eye candy sells it, so it should work, right? After working with this and a few other resins, I think I kind of get it now. Tabletop is meant to be poured in a very thin layer, so what happens sort of makes sense. My first attempt was utter disaster. I wanted to avoid flash curing, so I made the mistake of separating my resin into smaller cups, adding my mica powder, and then degassing. But here's what I ended up with. This could have been caused by the mica. I don't usually degas with additives mixed in, but again, it's all an experiment, right? I think it was just that there are too many bubbles in my mixture, which caused it to overflow as the pressure pushed the bubbles to the surface. I don't have this problem with most resins, but I'm always careful. Leave plenty of room in your cup so your resin doesn't overflow into the chamber. On my second attempt, I had some success. I didn't degas for fear of my last disaster, so I mixed my mica the way I always do and just let it stand while I checked the temperature. At 40 minutes, I was at 85, so I decided to pour. I'm starting by pouring into these small molds every 5 minutes to understand how the consistency changes. My hope being that I'll find the perfect moment to pour my mixture so the mica stays put. The resin was already pretty thick at this temperature, so I wanted to move quickly because it was only going to get thicker, but I'm limited by how fast the resin will move at this viscosity. Much of working with resin is learning to control the flow as you pour. It takes practice, so be patient. I keep pouring every 5 minutes to see how the resin reacts. I'm using black and white mica so you can see exactly what's happening as it moves. For my coaster, I'm trying to keep one color on each side, so I've got to pour slowly and in such a way that they don't start to blend together as soon as they touch. Resin is really slow work, and you've got to have a plan. The first part of that plan is to know that you're probably going to fail, and that's okay. You'll always learn something that way. As I pour, you can see that the resin is very thick and moving very slowly. This makes my job harder, and the harder it is to pour, the bigger a mess you're likely to make. The resin is also getting hot, around 100 degrees. This is part of the curing process. You'll often feel that your resin is warm in the cup, but if it's hot, you've got a problem. I'll show you that next. This was my third attempt with Promise, and it went really sideways. The cup I'm holding is called a split cup, meaning it has 3 sections in it for separate colors. I wanted to try these colors together, so this time I mixed up 160 milliliters, separated it into 3 cups, added my mica, and then poured into my split cup. I let it sit for 40 minutes because that's what had worked on test 2, but I made a mistake. Since I put all 160 milliliters essentially back in 1 cup, it got way too hot. I like to think of epoxy resin as a party. At first, the molecules are a little wary of each other. They're different viscosities. They're familiar with one another, but not friends because weird stuff happens when they get together. Then after a few drinks and a thorough stirring, they're besties. Nothing can stop them. They're going to take over the world. Everyone's getting along great for a while, having fun, meeting the new neighbors and loving them, whether they're glitter or mica powder, or even alcohol inks and Elmer's glue. This party is roaring. It's getting hot, and if there's too many of them together in the same room, stuff's going to go down. And that's what happened here. Too much partying. As you can see, the temperature spiked up to 160, and it may have gotten higher than that, but I knew I had to get that resin out of there in a hurry, so I just dumped it in the mold and hoped for the best. Flash cures aren't fun. I don't see a way to salvage a project like this, so I just threw in the towel and waited for it to cure and hoped my mold wasn't damaged. I've heard flash cures can create toxic fumes, and I believe it, but I use an air filter system and it didn't raise any red flags on this one. It was definitely hot in my hand, but I'm glad I had a thermometer to understand just how hot. As a side note, I'm no scientist, so my party analogy probably isn't great, but I'm sure everyone will have something to say in the comments anyway. It's also a big gloppy mess. That's because it's hardening too fast. I managed to get most of the resin out of the split cup, but left everything to cure so I could throw it away. Incidentally, those split cups are really fun to peel cured resin out of, as are most things made of silicone. Whenever possible, leave resin mistakes to cure. They're much easier to clean up that way. My split cup happily survived, which is wonderful because I use it a lot. Pulling cured resin from silicone is pretty fun in and of itself. But let's get back to test number 2. I've got my resin poured in the coaster and I'm just waiting for it to settle down. There are still quite a few bubbles and I'm going to hit them with my heat gun to see if I can pop them. This is heating the resin slightly, and in those spots it becomes more fluid, but this stuff is pretty thick and doesn't want to move much at all. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, that's kind of what I wanted. But 2 minutes ago probably would have been better. It would have still been fluid enough to pour, and now it's just kind of turning into a gel. That's just how fast your resin can change. Once I've got it leveled out in the mold, I'm going to let it sit for a while and watch what happens. I'll try to pop some more bubbles, but I'm really just watching to see how the mica moves. It's not moving very much, and when I say that, I mean each side of the resin. I've waited long enough to where the party is kind of broken up and it's just your 2 drunk uncles left, and they get along okay, but tend to stay away from each other. But within the separate sections, they're doing their own thing, deciding which side of the bed they're going to sleep on, who's going to kick who, but mostly they're down for the count. As things keep curing, they'll move a bit, but this is where you can really learn about your resin. You can literally watch it cure right in front of you. I know a lot of people like to do bloom resin pours, but that takes a lot of patience, like 2 days to see your finished multi-layer project because the face of it is in the bottom of the mold. Start with mica and you'll get to see exactly what's happening as it happens. I'm going to continue to monitor this for a while because as you can see, there's a ring starting to form where the resin meets the mold. The resin is pushing away from the silicone, so your uncles are starting to feel a little bit wedged in. Some of the mica particles are running to the middle of the mold, and there isn't really a way to stop that, but if I wait until just the right moment, I can probably move it enough to trick it. This will be different with every single resin you try, and sometimes even different pours from the same bottles. It all comes down to time and temperature. Over the next few minutes, I'll test out my ability to swirl the resin to make a design. This is where things get sticky, both literally and figuratively. The resin itself will still be moving for a while, so you can see the mica move too. But it's already turning into a solid, so if I go poking around in there, I might screw it up, usually in the form of bubbles. I'm using a dotting stylus to make my swirls, but you can use anything you don't mind ruining, but be cautious of a few things. 1, don't scrape the bottom of your mold when doing this. For one thing, that's too deep, and you will likely create some bubbles because this stuff is now very thick, like cold maple syrup. And 2, you can damage your mold and forever have scrape marks on the inside of your coaster bottoms. I've set that aside and we'll get back to it later. Next, we'll talk about Let's Resin Fast Cure. I hadn't tried a fast cure before, so I was excited for an experiment. You can supposedly demold after 4 hours, and I wonder how mica would work in it. Just out of the bottle, it's very thick, which again means a lot of bubbles. The instructions gave a 20-minute work time, but I plan to monitor the temperature closely. I knew I wanted to try to degas, so I did that and almost had an overflow, but I managed to catch it just in time. While that was cooking, I had gone back to my reliable mica mixing trick and poured just a bit in each cup and then added my powder. This is by far my favorite way to stir mica. Don't forget to hit it with the heat gun when it's in that small amount. Then when you pour in your larger amount, it'll stir together like butter. I'll add the rest of the resin to my pastes and check the temperature. After 10 minutes, I was up to 75 degrees and I wanted to see how it looked when pouring, but I decided to pour only about half of it. I let that sit for a while and continued to monitor the resin left in the cup. The resin in the mold looks great, but we know it's not going to look like that for long, so stay tuned. After 20 minutes, I swirled to see what kind of design I could come up with. It's always hard for me to decide when enough is enough, but it doesn't matter much. It's not going to look like that for long. I'll set that aside and pour my second coaster, but I realized that my resin has gotten pretty thick and it's not moving very fast, and I don't have quite half and half how I had planned. Since this is getting pretty thick, I'm going to muddle it a bit and set it aside so I can go back to see the other. I'm going to speed up the video here so you can see what's happening to the resin. I'll be muddling it, but trying to keep the design of my swirl as much as possible. But as you can see, the resin just keeps moving. I wasn't sure what to do with this other coaster since I hadn't poured it evenly. It kind of started to move in a way I wasn't expecting, as resin often does. I'm going to punt with this design because I'm not sure how it's going to look in the beginning, much less after a few hours. I'll see if I can move things around with my heat gun, but it seems to be doing its own thing. I'm going to try to get as close to the edge as I can so I can muddle that outer ring and the design will be more cohesive. Hopefully it will stop moving soon so I'll know what to do next. Make sure you're working slowly and not too deep. I'm going to continue to go back and forth between these two to see what I can make. I'll speed up the video so you can really see the resin moving. As you can see, no matter what I do, that resin is going to keep moving until it's good and ready to quit, so don't get too attached. And my final designs don't look anything like where I started, but I still kind of like them. That's why resin is fun. You never know what you're going to get. Here we are the next day, and as expected, things continued to move during its cure. I forgot to demold after 4 hours, but I don't care much. Most of my projects are just parked overnight. Even if they're not how I wanted them, they still look pretty cool. You can see on the back where I dug too deep because you can see my tool marks on the bottom. But it's not a big deal. If I want to give them to someone, I can just put a cork circle on the back. Our last brand is Craft Resin. I know this is really popular, but it's more expensive than Let's Resin, and it seems really similar. It has a very low viscosity, which equated to fewer bubbles. Part B is slightly thicker than A, but both were pretty thin and easy to pour. For my test, I poured at 40 minutes because that was the work time on the instructions, and the resin was at 91 degrees. Waiting longer could have caused a flash cure, so I figured it was safest to go for it. You can see the resin is thick, but still easy to pour. I let it sit for a while to see what happened. I'll speed up the video so you can watch too. I waited until 55 minutes to swirl the black and white together because this seemed pretty similar to Let's Resin, and that's when I poured that. I did a light swirl and didn't go too deep. I wanted to keep it as bubble-free as possible. Things are still moving pretty nicely at that point, but I don't want to press my luck by waiting too long. I continued to muddle the mica up to 90 minutes, much longer than any of the other brands. It stayed put pretty well from there. Here's the final reveal. The mica continued to move away from the mold like your drunk uncles, but since I kept muddling, it still looks pretty good. I'll use up the rest of this craft resin. I'm sure there's a really great application for it, but for mica, it's just okay. For the money, I'll stick with Let's Resin. It seems to be the best most-purpose resin, even though it doesn't work for coating. I don't know if I'll ever find the secret to mica in my resin, but I'm sure having fun trying. What's your favorite resin and why? If you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe. Here's one of my favorite tips to keep things tidy. I store my big bottles of resin in the basement, but keep a smaller amount upstairs in these dollar store condiment bottles. This set even has the measurements on the side so I know exactly how much I have left, and the plastic is really thin so I can hold them in my hands to warm them up. But don't forget to mark the bottles and the caps so you don't mix them up.